December 22nd, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. German General Heinrich von Luttwitz had sent an ultimatum. In the text, written with icy confidence, he demanded the honorable surrender of the encircled American troops. The order was accompanied by discreet laughter among the officers of the 47th Panzer Corps. Bastogne was just a formality. The Germans had the complete encirclement, more than twice as many men, hundreds of tanks, and the climate as an ally. The Americans, freezing in foxholes, were out of supplies, out of artillery, no chance. For the German High Command, victory was inevitable, and perhaps even monotonous. That certainty was about to be buried under tons of steel, fuel, and strategy. What the Germans called the last victorious offensive would become in the following days the mark of the logistical and moral collapse of the Third Reich in the face of a force that depended not only on bravery, but on doctrine, mobility, and supplies. This documentary will reveal how the siege of Bastogne, initially seen as a symbol of American fragility, exposed German strategic bankruptcy, and how George S. Patton, leading 250,000 men and 133,000 vehicles, turned an operational impossibility into a historic turnaround. Because Bastogne did not fall, it was the siege that broke. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any speech. In just 72 hours, 250,000 U.S. troops and 133,000 vehicles, tanks, trucks, ambulances, artillery pieces, spun the entire Third Army structure northward through one of Europe's most brutal winters, under conditions that, according to military experts, they would make any mechanized advance virtually impossible. While Germany bet everything on a lightning offensive, relying on the air blockade and Allied logistical collapse, America responded with the largest reaction maneuver on frozen ground in modern history. It was the collision between a doctrine based on tactical speed and one based on reserves, supply, and operational redundancy. And at the center of this clash, one word resounded as a challenge and response: nuts. If you value the detailed research, technical data, and memory of these decisive moments, please leave your support with a like and subscribe. This helps the channel to continue revealing the logistical, moral, and human backstage of the war, those that the books summarize, but that reality makes unforgettable. Major Wagner walked steadily through the snow, flanked by 2 enlisted men and a communications officer. At the front, a white flag. It was 11:30 a.m. on December 22nd, 1944, and the German group was crossing the frozen lines toward the American headquarters at Bastogne. In his hands, an ultimatum typed with an accent of victory: surrender now and avoid total annihilation. For the command of the 47th Panzer Corps, the proposal was almost a favor, and the American surrender was just a formality. With 55,000 German troops surrounding the city and more than 300 tanks available against 18,000 exhausted and hungry Americans, the expectation was not for battle. It was one of collapse. What the Germans called perfect operational fencing seemed on paper irrefutable. The weather was freezing any air relief, roads had been cut off, and American supplies were down to 1 meal a day. German intelligence claimed the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne were morally down, tactically isolated, and physically on the verge of collapse. And more importantly, the Wehrmacht's tactical doctrine still carried the convictions of the Blitzkrieg: speed, surprise, and concentrated superiority. Bastogne would be another piece on the board of the advance towards Antwerp. It was only a matter of time. The problem was that the Germans were reading maps, not contexts. And the doctrine they carried, shaped on the plains of Poland and the roads of France, did not grasp the scale of the new enemy they faced. An army shaped by factories, financed by oil, sustained by redundant supply routes, and, above all, fueled by a culture of scale. While the Germans calculated the encirclement based on terrain, position, and manpower, the Americans relied on something that did not fit in the Abwehr spreadsheets: logistical depth. German arrogance was not just rhetoric, it was doctrinaire. General Gerd von Rundstedt himself had declared in November 1944 that American morale was too technologically and spiritually fragile. For him, a break at the front would be enough to destabilize the Allied commands. This kind of thinking guided decisions at the top. The strategic vision of the Ardennes offensive was based on a tactical model that, although it had worked in 1940, was already outdated in the face of an enemy that thought in terms of tons, miles, and spare capacity. During the run-up to Operation Wacht am Rhein, Germany gathered its last strategic resources: 10,000 troops, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 2,600 artillery pieces. It was a formidable concentration, but with one critical detail: these numbers represented in practice the last real offensive reserve of the Reich. What the generals did not say in public, but the internal memos confirmed, was that there would be no quick replacement if this offensive failed. The fuel was counted with surgical precision. Each tank advance was measured in liters. The Luftwaffe, which would participate with limited support, already operated with fewer than 400 functional aircraft across the Western Front. Still, the belief persisted: Americans would give in. It was a bet based not on data, but on contempt. And, ironically, it was this contempt that sealed the failure even before the first tactical setback. Because in southern Belgium, George S. Patton had already read the German offensive before it began. And while the Germans gathered numbers, the Americans lined up alternative routes, stockpiles, and plans. One fact in particular reveals the gulf between the two operational cultures. The monthly production of Sherman medium tanks by the US in 1944 exceeded 1,200 units, almost triple the monthly production of German tanks of all models combined, not to mention the existing stocks and tanks already deployed in France since the liberation of Paris. If this data surprised you, comment now. Logistics wins, because this is where the war changes, not in the barrel of the cannon, but in the fuel pipeline, in the spare parts warehouse, in the production line running 24 hours a day in Detroit. The German underestimation was fueled by another factor: moral contempt. To many Wehrmacht officers, American soldiers were seen as unprepared, effeminate, too young, or, in the words of one captured diary, factory technicians with rifles. This misjudgment was not just prejudice, it was a failure of strategic reading. Bastogne showed that those technicians knew how to dig, shoot, and above all, resist. American doctrine, far from romanticizing combat, had specialized in withstanding, recomposing, and counterattacking with more force than the enemy expected. When the Germans sent the ultimatum of surrender to the city, what they were carrying was not just paper, it was the sum of all his certainties. Bastogne would fall because he had always fallen, because that was the script that had been working since 1939. But the war now was different. A conflict where the winner would not be the most daring on the field, but the most prepared off it. And the echo of this change was about to reach the German trenches with the force of an armored column. Because, while Major Wagner returned with the answer, nuts, in his hands, Patton's Third Army had already begun its maneuver. And between every link in that colossal movement, from tankers to the communication wire, was the key to what the Germans didn't calculate. America's industrial power marched through the snow, and he didn't come alone. In the next part, we will see how Patton reconfigured the entire doctrine of military reaction in 3 days, mobilizing 250,000 men along frozen routes, without collapse, without hesitation, and without waiting for orders. Because the American response to Bastogne did not come from above, it came from within. Bastogne wasn't just a city, it was the vital road junction of the Ardennes. 7 major roads intersected there, connecting Western Germany to the Allied logistical heartland in Belgium. For the German High Command, capturing it within 48 hours was a precondition for the whole plan: to open the way to Antwerp, cut the British and American armies in half, force a separate peace with the Westerners, and redirect forces to counter the Soviet advance in the east. The map showed Bastogne as a small dot surrounded by German arrows. In practice, it was the central cog of a machine that Hitler hoped to restart by force. On December 17, 1944, the 101st Airborne Division was hastily called up. His men, fresh from the Netherlands, were at rest. No winter gear, no extra ammunition, no up-to-date intelligence. Within hours, they boarded more than 380 trucks that snaked through the snowy roads toward the front. As entire columns of U.S. troops retreated south, the trucks of the 101st advanced toward the encirclement. Some fleeing soldiers shouted desperate warnings. "Come back! They're going to kill you all!" One skydiver replied without hesitation, "That's why we're going." Bastogne transformed, with each mile from an operational assignment to a death sentence announced. By the time the division arrived on the night of December 18th, the Germans were already at the gates. The first skirmishes occurred a few hours later. The blockade closed on the 20th. No road, no supply, no evacuation. Only the cold and the certainty that they were surrounded. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees Celsius, snow covering everything, frozen mud, wounds that rotted before being treated. Command of the city came under the temporary responsibility of General Anthony McAuliffe, an artillery officer known for his calm under pressure. But even he was not prepared for what they would face. The American artillery was reduced to 10 rounds per piece per day. Food was rationed into a dry meal for 24 hours. Many soldiers resorted to snow to hydrate themselves. Others shared frozen rations with civilians hiding in basements. The extreme cold produced mass freezes. Doctors operated without morphine, improvising anesthesia with brandy and tourniquets. In one of the perimeter trenches, a soldier lost all his toes. They detached inside his boots. He didn't scream. He no longer felt anything. At the makeshift aid station, Belgian nurse Renée Lemaire cared for both wounded Americans and Germans. She would not survive the siege. Bastogne became, day after day, a capsule of resistance outside of time, where one no longer fought for positions, but for survival. The Germans, on the outside, interpreted the American silence as desperation. They did not know that he was discipline, but the paratroopers were not alone. One reinforcement group had stayed behind, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, under Colonel William Roberts, with approximately 40 operational tanks and 2,800 men. Alongside them was the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with the fast M18 Hellcat, capable of speeds exceeding any German armored vehicle. Also present were African-American units of the 969th Artillery, which faced not only enemy howitzers, but structural bias within the army itself. Still, they fought and made their presence felt. In total, the forces in Bastogne numbered about 18,000 troops. Against them marched 3 German divisions, among them the elite 2nd Panzer Division, supported by more than 130 tanks and more than 17,000 infantry from the 26th Volksgrenadier. It was a ratio of over 3-to-1, with armored supremacy and logistical superiority on the German side. With each night attack, the American line retreated a little, then turned back. McAuliffe was constantly redeploying forces, ignoring the cold, leaning back on muddy maps. The radios failed, the ammunition ran out, but the city remained intact. And yet, outside, the Germans remained convinced that they were watching the end. A report intercepted days later would reveal the expectation that the Americans would surrender by Christmas. The failure of this prediction was not strategic, it was cultural, because Bastogne, in German eyes, had already been beaten by statistics. But inside the trenches, there was another calculation being made, a calculation based on honor, memory, and faith in the improbable. And this type of account did not appear in Hitler's intelligence reports. Most paradoxically, while the Germans became convinced of the inevitability of the American fall, they ignored the very signs of collapse: excessive fuel consumption because of the frozen terrain, difficulty in resupplying columns under Allied bombardment, exhausted soldiers after days of non-stop fighting, and total dependence on a quick victory, because there was no supply for a long offensive. Time, which they believed to be their ally, was beginning to erode their offensive from the inside out. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, US soldiers learned to die slowly, but also to resist together. As one Easy Company sergeant wrote in his diary, "We are no longer fighting for victory. We are fighting to let them know that they did not win." Bastogne was no longer a dot on the map. It became an altar, a fixed point at which the American doctrine of quiet resistance, supported by a colossal rearguard, would prove its worth in the face of an enemy who still believed that the war could be won with arrows on the map. And as the Germans tried to topple that frozen fortress, one name was gaining traction in the south: a general with a deep voice, strategic impatience, and plans too ready to be coincidental. The next installment will reveal how George S. Patton had already predicted Bastogne days before the siege closed, and why, when the Allied generals hesitated, he already had tanks supplied, routes mapped out, and 3 operational plans ready for execution. On December 19, 1944, in the city of Verdun, as Bastogne was plunging into cold and darkness, the main Allied commanders hastily assembled. General Eisenhower wanted an urgent reaction to the German offensive that threatened to fracture the Western line. The room was loaded with tension. Maps showed the German advance as a blade opening the Ardennes. Most of those present were considering defensive possibilities, but one man interrupted the meeting with a phrase that would change the course of the war: attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. George Smith Patton, commander of the Third Army, spoke as if he had already begun to execute. The answer was skepticism. It was winter, the roads were frozen, the Third Army was positioned to the east, and no American offensive was planned for that sector. But Patton did not make proposals based on hope. It operated with forecasts, alternate routes, and pre-positioned supplies. The truth is that Patton already expected something like Bastogne. Throughout November, his intelligence team had detected suspicious movements to the north. Colonel Oscar Koch, his head of intelligence, warned of the possibility of a large-scale German offensive. While Allied eyes were fixed on the advance to the Rhine, Patton kept his rear on alert, and his plans ready to turn. This preparation was not the result of luck. It was the direct product of American operational doctrine, which Patton passionately embodied. Each division under his command had been instructed to maintain mobilization capability in less than 72 hours. Fuel depots have been quietly repositioned, spare parts warehouses duplicated, communication routes reconstructed with redundancy. The result was an architecture of war that could rotate, literally, on its own axis. Patton did not plan to react. He planned to anticipate. When the German offensive was confirmed, he only activated what was already underway. The irony is that while Hitler staked his last major offensive on the rigidity of his strategy, the Americans reacted with elasticity. Patton didn't just change the direction of his army. He did it in real time, in the middle of winter, with 250,000 men and more than 130,000 vehicles traveling simultaneously on ice-covered roads. No collapse, no logistical congestion, no hesitation. It was the doctrine of mobility put to the test and working like a thin cog of steel. The secret was not only in the will to move forward, but in the ability to fuel that advance. Each Sherman tank moving north required 175 gallons of gasoline. A full convoy of an armored division consumed more than 50,000 gallons a day. Patton knew this. Their logistics engineers knew this. And more importantly, American industry knew this and had prepared for it. A War Department report dated October 1944 stated that fuel stocks on French territory would allow intense operations for 90 days, even in the event of severe disruptions. This was not a prediction. It was planning transformed into operational superiority. The general did not march with faith. He marched with numbers. In addition to fuel, there was maintenance. Tanks break, trucks get stuck, communications fail. Patton instituted an in-depth maintenance structure. Mobile repair units, workshops on wheels, engineers advancing along with the platoons. In one of the columns, a tank suffered engine failure 40 kilometers from the front. It was replaced by another in less than 2 hours. The faulty tank was repaired and reincorporated into the advance the next day. This efficiency caused strangeness even among British allies accustomed to slower campaigns. A British officer wrote, "The Americans treat war as they treat an assembly line. It's baffling and incredibly effective." Patton didn't command an army, he commanded a movement plant, and every piece worked. But there was another factor, one that was not measured in barrels or gallons: faith. Patton was no ordinary general. He was a man of contradictions, mystical, aggressive, vain, but absolutely committed to victory. On December 14th, realizing the worsening weather and the risk of air isolation in Bastogne, he ordered a prayer to be printed and distributed to all 250,000 soldiers under his command. The text asked God to stop the blizzard and allow operations to resume. Patton himself demanded that priest chaplains oversee the distribution. It wasn't theater, it was part of the doctrine. Because for him, faith and logistics went hand in hand. A tank needed gasoline, but the soldier who drove it needed something more. Patton understood this. Therefore, while the Germans believed that the snow was their ally, he asked for it to break. And days later, she left. The generals assembled at Verdun were slow to accept that Patton's plan was feasible. But when the divisions began to turn, when the convoys began to climb the frozen roads, when the radios confirmed that each alternative route was working, doubt gave way to conviction. It was not a bluff. It was a counterattack in gestation. And the German command, still convinced that Bastogne would fall by starvation, had no idea that it was about to be outflanked by one of the greatest tactical movements of modern warfare. A Wehrmacht officer, captured weeks later, summed it up bitterly. "We thought the Americans were slow. They were faster than our panic." And Patton's march was just the beginning. In the next part, you'll see how this army on the move advanced 100 miles in 72 hours, with tanks that consumed more than locomotives, non-stop, non-retreat, and with plenty of supply. Because America didn't just have tanks. There was the road, the truck, and the fuel for each of them. The Third Army's maneuver wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a logistical choreography designed with industrial precision. By December 22nd, while the Germans were still celebrating the isolation of Bastogne, Patton's convoys were already advancing north down the icy roads of France. There were 160 kilometers covered in 72 hours, but it was not a symbolic column. There were 250,000 men, more than 133,000 vehicles, 20,000 tons of ammunition, fuel and medical supplies in constant rotation. Every kilometer, a temporary refueling station was set up. Every 10 kilometers, an engineering team repaired bridges, removed jammed vehicles, and installed telephone wires to maintain terrestrial communication, which was more reliable than radio under extreme weather conditions. Each Sherman tank consumed 175 gallons per day. One armored division alone required about 50,000 gallons a day. To keep up the line, the mobile depots had been stocked weeks earlier, strategically spread out every 30 kilometers, with replenishment guaranteed by a chain of trucks that operated 24 hours a day. a system that the Germans, based on supply captures and fixed lines, were never able to imitate. American war doctrine did not see logistics as a support, it saw it as a weapon. What Patton wielded at that moment was not only the spearhead of the offensive, but the entire fist of American industry propelling each unit. Medical operations were also marching. Mobile field hospitals were set up at regular intervals with generators, medicines and surgeons. Repair teams, made up of civilian mechanics integrated into the army, reassembled damaged vehicles in full gear. On average, 74% of the broken tanks were back in operation in less than 48 hours. For comparison, the German recovery rate in the same period was less than 30%, partly due to the shortage of standardized parts, and also due to the deterioration of the rail system. While Germany cut tracks to slow down the Allies, American engineers rebuilt roads in a matter of hours. In one specific case, a convoy of trucks was diverted because of a destroyed bridge. Within 16 hours, a new Bailey Bridge was installed. Over it, 48 tons of armored vehicles passed towards Bastogne. It was the collapse of the German assumption that winter would halt war. In fact, it only froze the battlefield, making the Allies' movements even quieter, even more unexpected. Within Patton's army, there was a unit dedicated solely to the communications facility, the Signal Corps. They were the ones who laid more than 8,000 meters of telephone wire per day, interconnecting platoons, command posts, and medical units. While the Germans tried to maintain contact on the basis of short-range radios, each American division had dual redundancy of communication, by radio and by wire. American doctrine foresaw failures, and so it survived them. A written messaging system with trained messengers was still maintained in critical areas. Nothing was left to chance. This meticulous care contrasted sharply with the improvisation that marked the German advance. In some panzer units, a single vehicle carried the radio batteries of the entire company. If it was destroyed, the entire unit operated blind. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The Germans despised the American approach, calling it a truck war. But it was this war of trucks, fueled, coordinated and disciplined, that moved the impossible. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content about the real engineering behind the victory. Because this is not just the story of tanks and battles, but of spreadsheets, calculations and telephone cables, the invisible weapons of modern warfare. But progress alone was not enough. The terrain was hostile, the weather unpredictable, and the enemy still lethal. Patton's subordinate commanders, such as General Manton Eddy of the 13th Corps, operated with controlled freedom, adapting routes and adjusting schedules without disrupting the maneuver's cohesion. This operational flexibility, rare in highly hierarchical military structures, was possible because American doctrine valued local initiative with absolute support from the rear. A convoy that got stuck in the mud received help from an engineering battalion without the chain of command needing to be consulted. The goal was only one: to arrive on time. And time, at that time, was the most precious asset of the war. Meanwhile, the Germans observed the siege of Bastogne as a countdown victory. The city was still surrounded. No plane flew overhead. No reinforcement was visible. General von Lüttwitz was already considering redeploying his units to the next target. But what he didn't know, and his intelligence failed to realize, was that the ground beneath his feet was already shaking. The American offensive was approaching with unexpected speed, supported by a machine that did not sleep, did not freeze, and did not hesitate. A German officer captured in January would confess, "We believed that the Americans could not move in the winter. They didn't just move, they swallowed us with a roar of an engine." And that roar was about to cross the German line. In the next part, we'll look at how the 4th Armored Division, the tip of Patton's spear, found in the midst of the chaos a forgotten road, a breach in the enemy flank, and a fate steeped in ice. Bastogne. The city that should have fallen began to hear, for the first time, the sound of liberation. The winter of 1944 was not just a scenario, it was an enemy. The Western Front was plunged into a climatic breakdown rarely seen in Europe. Incessant snowstorms, temperatures below 20 degrees Celsius, and a fog so dense that on some days soldiers could see no further than their own rifles. Bastogne was submerged in this white abyss. No plane flew overhead, no parachutes brought supplies, no sun broke the sky. For the Germans, it was the harbinger of victory. The High Command believed that weather conditions had sealed the encirclement. Without Allied air support, American material superiority was nullified. In Berlin, Goebbels even issued communiques extolling General Winter as the new commander of the front. But on the American side, another doctrine prevailed, one that did not wait for the climate to subside, but trained to meet it. While the Germans were counting on the enemy's paralysis, Patton reorganized mobility under ice. Sherman tanks were given thermal blankets over the engines, filled with preheated gasoline to prevent crystallization. Mobile workshops transported special low-temperature oil. Armored crews were instructed to keep the engines idling all night, not for immediate mobility, but so that the machine wouldn't freeze to a standstill. Refueling trucks operated in pairs. One carried fuel, the other spare parts, because breakdown was inevitable, but the delay was not. Even the boots have been redesigned. The U.S. Army had distributed 600,000 pairs of insulating-soled shoes for winter operations, in contrast to German troops, many of whom still wore the old longshaft model from the 1940 campaign, now useless against extreme freezing. But not every adaptation was mechanical. Part of it came from faith. On December 14th, Patton ordered the printing of a prayer card for all 250,000 troops under his command. The text asked God to stop the blizzards and allow operations to resume. The gesture was met with skepticism by some officers, but with hope by soldiers in the trenches. In the rear, priests held impromptu masses as often as mechanics changed parts. For Patton, prayer was more than spiritual, it was psychological. He understood that in a war waged against the weather, the mind also froze. Maintaining morale meant keeping the machine running. Each soldier who believed that the sky would open was one more engine-resisting collapse. The irony of this frozen war was that, for the Germans, the cold was an asset, but also a trap. Many of the 5th Panzer Division's armored vehicles began to suffer hydraulic breakdown due to the ice accumulated in the fluid lines. Diesel, more viscous than American gasoline, crystallized in the early mornings. Batteries were discharged even before sunrise. One company commander reported that more than 40% of his vehicles were pinned down not by enemy fire, but by freezing. Meanwhile, Patton's columns were moving, slow but steady, a living chain of heating, supply and communication that refused to stop, even if it had to push its tanks down entire stretches of road. In one such case, the 4th Armored Division was forced to improvise rolls of wood under tracks to traverse a frozen minefield. They did not lose a single vehicle. American air supremacy, in fact, had been temporarily annulled. But Signal Corps engineers, anticipating this scenario, increased ground redundancy. Thousands of feet of telephone wire were installed daily, connecting even forward platoons with their headquarters. Medical units operated with generators protected by double tents, and surgeons learned to perform amputations with gloves. Not for hygiene, but to prevent their fingers from freezing when holding metal scalpels. On the battlefield, the atmosphere killed in silence. Soldiers died of hypothermia before they were even hit. A report by the 26th Division estimated that between 17 and 24 December, 28% of casualties had been caused solely by the cold. And yet, the machine did not stop. Because unlike the Germans, the Americans didn't ask for the weather to help them, only for it not to stop them. On December 23rd, something changed. The sky began to clear. The fog subsided. A captain of the 101st wrote in his diary, "It looked as if someone had blown the clouds in anger. Planes began to appear, like gleaming shadows overhead." P-47. Thunderbolts fought their way through with machine guns. Soon behind, C-47s began dropping supplies over Bastogne. The green boxes fell like solid rain of salvation: ammunition, food, medicine, radios. In some areas, the Americans rushed out of the trenches to collect the parachutes before the Germans saw them. It was the breaking of the blizzard, and with it, the return of American supremacy. In retrospect, the German mistake was to rely too much on the weather, as if war were made of predictions rather than adaptations. The cold was real, but the ability to resist it even more so. The difference between the two armies was in the details, in the preheating of the fuel, the wires buried in the snow, the insulated boots, and the printed prayers. The doctrine of the Third Reich had provided for everything, except flexibility, and when the heavens opened, this flaw became clear. In the next part, we will look at the moment when the vanguard of the 4th Armoured Division broke through the German defences south of Bastogne. An advance that should not have been possible, according to German calculations, but which was enabled by something they never knew how to measure: the strength of an army on the move, with intact morale, heated tanks, and faith in the improbable. On the morning of December 22, 1944, a German courier crossed the front lines under a white flag, carrying an official ultimatum. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the ex-CB Panzer Corps, demanded the immediate surrender of the American forces at Bastogne. The justification was straightforward. The Americans were surrounded, with no reinforcements, no supplies, no prospect. Surrender, according to the document, was the only way to avoid total annihilation. The answer came a few hours later. General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, read the German text coolly, smiled, and he uttered a single word: nuts. When his officers suggested that this answer might be confusing to the Germans, McAuliffe stood his ground. "They can translate as they want," he said. And so it was. The answer was written, delivered, and received on the other end of the line with bewilderment. The German translator hesitated. "Nüsse?" he asked, not understanding if it was a joke or an offense. German officials argued over whether it was slang, code, or veiled disrespect. But the real meaning went beyond language. Nuts wasn't just a word, it was a state of mind. It was the collapse of military logic in the face of a force that did not come from weapons, but from morals. By this time, Bastogne was already facing extreme shortages. The soldiers shared frozen sea rations. A single blanket served 2 men. Grenades were saved like gold. Seriously injured people were waiting for evacuation that would not come. And yet, no one gave up position. The answer, nuts, went through the trenches like an invisible signal. There was no way to beat them, but there was a way not to fall. In his diary, one sergeant wrote, "If McAuliffe had the courage to say this looking at the end, the least I can do is carry 1 more box of ammunition." The word became a flag. It was scribbled on helmets, written in charcoal on the walls of shelters, repeated between teeth cracked from cold. Morale, which should have collapsed, has grown. And this resistance was not only psychological, it undermined the German operational calculation itself. Von Luttwitz expected the siege to collapse within 3 days. The American silence after the ultimatum was interpreted as blind obstinacy or madness. But it was neither. It was doctrine. The soldiers of the 101st had been trained to resist in isolation for up to 7 days. Its decentralized structure allowed for rapid redistribution of ammunition and artillery between sectors. Even without constant central command, the companies knew what to do: hold on. With each passing day, the Germans needed to move more units to maintain the encirclement. This meant fewer troops available for the main offensive towards Antwerp, and every minute that Bastogne resisted increased the chance of Patton'S reinforcements arriving. What began as bravado has become the axis of strategic resistance. German superiority in numbers and armament was real, but it collapsed in the face of an immaterial force, identity. McAuliffe's response activated something that intelligence reports could never have predicted. Bastogne has become a symbol. An Easy Company skydiver described, "Nobody wanted to be the first to fall, and no one wanted to be the last to back down, so we stay." The siege, far from breaking morale, solidified it. With each attack repelled, confidence grew. In one of these engagements, near Neuville's crossing, 3 outnumbered Shermans faced 7 Panzer IVs. At the end of the battle, the crew rescued survivors from the other armored vehicles, one of them with severe burns. There was no escape. There was continuation. To Belgian civilians sheltering in the basements of Bastogne, the silence of the trenches meant one thing: the Americans were still alive. They reported that, even without heating, American soldiers shared blankets, rations, and water. Nurse Renée Lemaire, who cared for the wounded in a makeshift hospital, wrote in her last letter, "They say nuts as if it were a prayer, and maybe it is." When the hospital was hit by a German bomb days later, Lemaire died, but his memory was linked to the same spirit of resistance, which is not surrendered even when there is no way out. On the German side, perplexity turned into frustration. The original plan called for the occupation of Bastogne within 48 hours. After 6 days, von Luttwitz's forces were exhausted. German logistics, already fragile, began to fail. Poorly fed troops, tanks without fuel, intermittent communication. Bastogne, instead of conquest, became a drain. Each platoon held, there was one less platoon on the main front. The 2nd Panzer Division, which was due to break through to the west, was forced to redirect some of its armor to maintain the encirclement. And even so, they did not advance. A German officer captured in January revealed the High Command's bewilderment. "We didn't understand. They had nothing, and yet they did not back down. Bastogne was like a hole that wouldn't budge." This German incomprehension is what makes nuts so powerful, because it was not an isolated gesture but the reflection of a much deeper structure, the American doctrine of decentralized resistance, fueled by clever logistics and led by self-sufficient morale. The Germans saw numbers, maps, and probabilities. Americans saw every inch as a position, every trench as a statement. In the next part, we will see the moment when this moral resistance finally meets the outstretched arm of liberation. When the 4th Armored Division sees the smoke from Bastogne for the first time, and when the 101st Armored Division's radios, still working by a technical miracle, receive the transmission that would change everything. "We're coming." December 23, 1944, at 10:38 a.m., Bastogne's white silence was broken by a rising metallic sound. As they looked up at the sky, the soldiers of the 101st saw what they had been waiting for 7 days: the sun. For the first time since the siege began, the clouds parted like curtains pulled by force, and along with the light came the shadows of the C-47s. One after another, in millimeter formation, 241 planes of the 9th Air Force crossed the sky with surgical precision. Each aircraft carried packages, 1,246 in all, of supplies, ammunition, radio, thermal suits, blood plasma, and hope. The planes flew low, at risk of anti-aircraft artillery, guided by hand flares, smoke, and portable radios. The ground was frozen, the parachutes opened like urgent flowers, and the impossible began to fall from the sky. The recovery rate of supplies was 95%, under fire, under cold, at total risk. No army in history up to that point had achieved such a precise, so fast, so synchronized air resupply operation. Each package recovered meant not just survival. It meant confirmation that the outside world still existed. Wounded people could be treated with morphine. Doctors returned to operating with sterile instruments. Machine guns returned to spitting fire. It was as if the heavens had signed an armistice with courage. The psychological effect was immediate. Reports indicate that German soldiers, upon seeing the air operation in action, understood that the siege was doomed. The Luftwaffe tried to react. FW-190 fighters and Ju-88 bombers were hastily launched to intercept the C-47s. But the sky no longer belonged to Germany. The Nazi Air Force was in technical collapse. There was a lack of experienced pilots, fuel, and, above all, enough planes. Only 30% of the designated aircraft managed to take off. And of those that did, many faced mechanical failures before they even reached their goal. In the same period, the American industry produced 7,000 planes per month. The Germans, less than 2,200. The gap was brutal and growing. A statistic ignored by Berlin that December, the United States had a transport fleet almost 6 times larger than that of all the Axis powers combined. If this number surprises you, write in the comments. Logistics wins. Because that's the story behind the victory, not just the steel, but the invisible cog that moves it. Supplies were not just thrown at random. Each package was color-coded and targeted. Ammunition in red, plasma in white, food in green, radios and parts in blue. The drop zones were marked by paratroopers with flags and flares, even at the risk of being shot at. This operation required a level of air-ground coordination that only a highly trained, equipped and fueled force could accomplish. The SCR-300 radio, used by the 101st, was essential. It operated at a safe frequency, with enough range to coordinate the zones even with atmospheric interference. The US Army had deployed more than 50,000 of these radios on the European front, each made with interchangeable components, making them easier to maintain and standardize. It was more than a piece of communication. It was a logistical link. Air supply didn't just relieve Bastogne. He inverted the siege equation. What was once a strategic trap has become a tactical deviation. Each charge dropped allowed the city's defenders to remain operational for another day, and each more day meant an extra advance for Patton'S troops. While the Germans maintained a static encirclement, the Americans operated a dynamic, invisible aerial encirclement. And this siege of supply and patience proved to be more lethal than any tank. Inside the city, morale turned to obstinacy. With each parachute fall, the soldiers ran as if it were gold. In one case, reported by a medical officer, a plasma charge fell on a mine. The explosive failed, frozen by the cold, and the plasma was recovered intact. The same cold that killed, now saved. In another drop zone, civilians and soldiers cooperated to collect the boxes before they fell into German hands. A 14-year-old Belgian girl reportedly guided 2 soldiers to a box lost in the trees, and for doing so received a makeshift medal made of a golden button and torn ribbon. It was not only the army that resisted, it was an entire city. The Germans knew they had lost their advantage when the first C-47s went unpunished. Von Lüttwitz, upon being informed of the resumption of air supplies, reportedly said, "The next flag will be white." German intelligence confirmed that after the 24th, it would be impossible to maintain the siege for more than 72 hours. With no air support, no advances on the Western Front, and with the growing threat of the Third Army to the south, Bastogne had ceased to be a target and had become a trap for the Siegers themselves. In the next part, you'll see how the tanks of the 4th Armoured Division broke through the last obstacle between Neuchâtel and Bastogne, and how a radio, a sergeant, and a frozen road sealed the meeting between the siege and its liberation. Because tanks break sieges, but radios, maps, and men with courage break history. On December 26, 1944, at 4:45 p.m., a Sherman M4A3E2 tank with camouflage paint and hand-painted name on the side Cobra King tore through the village of Patton'S under sporadic fire, cutting its way through the ice with a mechanical roar that shook the frozen ground. In front of you, the road to Bastogne. Behind him, 60 tons of steel, ammunition and morale. The Cobra King was not just any tank. It was the first spearhead of the 37th Tank Battle, 4th Armored Division, assigned by General Patton himself to lead the breakthrough. Beside it, infantry from the 318th Regiment marched at a fast pace, in sync with the machine. The advance was not improvised, it was choreographed. Field artillery had bombarded the flanks of the road with more than 2,000 shells in just 15 minutes, destroying anti-tank positions and machine gun nests before the armor even appeared. Every second of the operation was timed. Each platoon had up-to-date maps and alternate routes. It was American doctrine in its most lethal form: speed, volume, and coordination. The Germans had prepared for the advance, but not for the way it came. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division had positioned units along the road, with mines and 75mm guns hidden in barns and dense woods. But American intelligence, operating with radio intercepts and prior aerial reconnaissance, identified the main risk zones. The Hellcats of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion were positioned on the flank, ambushing the Panzer IVs with fire from more than 200 yards away before they could even aim. One after another, the German armored vehicles were neutralized. The advance did not stop. When a mine hit the second tank of the column, immobilizing it, the third veered along the side of the road, creating a new trail in the ice. The soldiers did not wait for commands. They knew what to do. They had rehearsed. Bastogne was not a mission. It was a moral commitment. Meanwhile, on the city's inner lines, the radios of the 101st Airborne tuned to a frequency that had been expected for days. At 5:04 p.m., a decoded transmission was received. American tanks sighted to the south. The news traveled through the basements, the trenches, the corridors of hospitals. Some soldiers cried, others did not believe it, but the sound could not be confused. It was the metallic roar of Allied engines breaking through the crust of the siege. The 4th Division had arrived, and behind it would come the full weight of American industry, reinforcements, supplies, medical evacuation, and retaliation. The rupture was not clean. The Cobra King faced direct combat in the narrow streets of Patton'S, with German shells ricocheting off the hull and shrapnel hitting the surrounding infantry. A platoon of Panzerfausts approached from the sides. The tank commander ordered the firing of a canister, a projectile that fragmented into hundreds of steel spheres. The street was cleared in seconds. Minutes later, the tank encountered a makeshift Wehrmacht command post. 3 officers surrendered. The siege was beginning to crumble, not only militarily but symbolically. The German belief that the city would fall, that American logistics would not cope, that the weather would save them, was crushed under snow-covered mats. By the end of the day, 276 Allied vehicles had crossed the southern perimeter of Bastogne. The exhausted troops of the 101st met with the ice and mud-smeared men of the 4th Division. There was no celebration. Just a nod, a silent greeting between units that knew the price of each kilometer. Bastogne was technically liberated, but still in danger. The Germans would launch counterattacks in the following days, but the crack was made, and the pressure would now come from the American side. Patton didn't just break the siege, he redesigned the doctrine of rupture, no longer in slow waves, but in fast, precise, integrated fists. Cobra King's advance became doctrine for future penetration operations into enemy territory. The effectiveness of the operation was a direct result of the coordination between 3 pillars: pre-planned artillery with computerized ballistic calculation, mechanized infantry with continuous supply via protected convoys, and short-range radio-coordinated tactical air support between aircraft and ground units. Each system worked as a cog in a larger machine. There was no improvisation. There was redundancy. If one route failed, another emerged. If a tank broke down, a repair crew was already on its way. The American doctrine was clear. War is not won at the front, but in the rear, which feeds the front without ceasing. Germany, which in 1940 had dazzled the world with blitzkrieg, now saw its own doctrine being overcome, not by pure speed, but by sustained speed. A German general interrogated after the war stated, "They attacked at full strength in 48 hours, and they maintained that force for weeks. We could attack fast, but not sustain. They could do both." It was the final collapse of German logic. To win by momentum. The Americans won by the system. In the next part, we'll reveal the strategic impact of this disruption on the war landscape and how Bastogne's operation became the model for large-scale invasions, influencing combat doctrines for decades. Because a battle won does not end on the field. It continues in manuals, in military academies, and in the memory of those who saw the impossible being crossed by a tank with a hand-painted name. After the breaking of the siege at Bastogne, what began to crumble was not just the German front line, it was the very mental architecture that underpinned the Wehrmacht. In the weeks following the rescue operation, Allied intelligence reports began to record a rare phenomenon among enemy troops: spontaneous confessions of moral defeat. Captured officers narrated a feeling of internal collapse, as one major of the 26th Volksgrenadier described it. "We expected them to break down, but they were the ones who broke us." German doctrine, built on a belief in speed, surprise, and superior discipline, was crushed by something not in the Berlin textbooks: operational resilience. Bastogne was not just a geographical defeat, it was an ideological humiliation. The idea that the US military was inexperienced, technology-dependent, and vulnerable to the weather was belied in every frozen trench, in every tank that advanced over ice, in every parachute that brought supplies, even under fire. The Wehrmacht did not know how to react when the adversary refused to act according to script. It was like fighting a wall that bled but didn't fall. The letters seized from German soldiers began to demonstrate an unprecedented pattern: doubt. A soldier from the 2nd SS Panzer wrote, "We were told they would be weak, that it would be enough to surround them. But they resist as if winter doesn't affect them, as if they were expecting." The same cold that German generals considered an ally, an invisible general, came to be seen by the troops as punishment, while the Americans seemed to operate within it. This psychological inversion is an invisible mark of the strategic turn. When an army believes that the enemy is unstoppable, it doesn't have to be. The defeat is already underway. The 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, elite units trained to hold out to the last man, began to record spontaneous desertions after the fall of the siege. In the trenches, officers noticed soldiers exchanging badges, burning papers with their names on them, and trying to infiltrate among civilian refugees. The lightning war, once a symbol of glory, had turned into a logistical nightmare. German offensive doctrine required constant advancement. There was no structural preparation for wars of prolonged attrition, much less in conditions where the supply line was interrupted. A clear example emerged in the days following the defeat at Bastogne. An armored battalion of the 116th Panzer was ordered to retreat for lack of fuel, not because of a tactical decision, but because of an inability to refuel. Each Tiger tank required more than 500 liters of fuel to operate a single day of combat. The weakened Luftwaffe could no longer carry out large-scale aerial refueling. Trucks were scarce, and the frozen roads prevented any attempt at mechanized rescue. In contrast, the US Army maintained supply convoys every 20 kilometers, supplied by a chain of railroads and parallel routes with planned redundancy. Even in blizzard, the Americans filled each Sherman tank with its 175 gallons a day, like a moving assembly line. German faith in tactical superiority, which had underpinned campaigns from Poland to the early USSR, would not survive Bastogne. It was a faith that was not based on numbers, but on memory. Germany in 1944 still believed in the glories of 1940, but the world had changed. The Americans didn't just learn from the mistakes of Kasserine and Salerno, they systematized the correction. Each previous defeat was transformed into a given, each failure into protocol. The force that liberated Bastogne was the optimized version of an army that had suffered, learned, and evolved under pressure. It was a machine that adapted faults in real time. And for a German army that still functioned under vertical orders and rigid doctrine, this flexibility was invisible, even overwhelming. Behind the scenes of the defeat, German frustration was visible. Officers reported the inability to keep up with the pace of advance. At an emergency conference between commanders of the 6th SS Panzer, a colonel summed up the situation. "If they continue to react with this speed and precision, our every advance will be a mistake to be corrected later." The battlefield had changed. It was no longer the place of brilliant action, of the masterstroke. Now, it was the domain of support. Victory was guaranteed not by those who attacked better, but by those who kept the attack going, even when there seemed to be no energy left. Bastogne also revealed the bankruptcy of a mentality. The idea that victory was a matter of German moral superiority and discipline was shattered by the simple refusal of surrender by starving and ill-equipped soldiers. Nuts was not just an answer, it was a mirror, and the Germans saw its distorted reflection. They were not defeated by superior weapons. They were defeated by a structure that they did not consider possible, and this was, for many, more humiliating than any retreat. Over the next few weeks, the German High Command attempted to reorganize its forces, but something had been lost. The sparkle in his eyes, the certainty that the next offensive would bring results, disappeared. The soldiers knew. The war was being won not by the battlefield, but by the depot, the railroad, the hangar, the radio. Superiority was no longer in the hands of the general, but in the closed circuit that united all levels of the American army, from the rear to the front commander. The German machine, proud of its precision, was surpassed by another, more flexible, deeper, more prepared for time. In the next part, we'll look at how this quiet victory, built on supply boxes and radio cables, became a model for the future, and how Bastogne's lessons echoed in the military manuals of the following decades, as German generals tried to understand how they lost a battle that, on paper, was already won. On the other side of the line of fire, between trenches dug into the ice and commands transmitted in whispers, German soldiers watched Bastogne not just as a target, but as a growing unknown. When the siege began, the expectation was that they would surrender in 3 days. The 101st Airborne, though experienced, had been hastily launched, ill-equipped, lacking heavy artillery and lacking air cover. The German forecast was pragmatic. The city would fall by starvation or freeze. But the days passed, the nights became longer, and something began to unsettle observers on the German side. The enemy not only resisted, he counterattacked. Officers' diaries reveal a tone that shifts from superiority to incredulity. A lieutenant in the 5th Paratrooper Division wrote, "They fight like demons. We don't know where the supplies come from. We thought they would die in there." It was the beginning of a break, not of the front, but of perception. The interrogations conducted after the breaking of the siege brought even more revealing accounts. Captured officers described American soldiers as immune to fatigue and unable to retreat even when it was logical to do so. A colonel of Panzer Lehr, a unit considered elite within the German armored structure, confessed in a tone of bewilderment, "We believed that the Americans would give up as soon as the encirclement was complete, but there was something about them, a quiet expectation, as if they already knew they would be saved." This kind of emotional analysis was rare in Wehrmacht reports. It was a sign that something deeper had been shaken, the monopoly of conviction. Until then, German doctrine had been fueled by the belief that its soldiers were the most disciplined, their tanks the most feared, and their leadership the most experienced. The enemy was described as overly technical, reliant on supplies, and slow to react to changes in the field. But Bastogne dismantled this stereotype. When the Americans continued to fight even with gangrenous feet, even without warm-up, even without guarantee of reinforcement, the Germans began to see not an inferior adversary, but a distorted mirror. The tactical superiority they believed they had was emptied in the face of the enemy's adaptive superiority. Some reports contain phrases that seem more like confessions of spiritual defeat than military ones. A radio operator from the 2nd SS Division Das Reich wrote, "We heard the Americans singing in the trenches, singing as if they knew something we don't." And maybe they did. They knew that somewhere behind the frozen hills, tanks were on the move. They knew their planes would come back. They knew that their rear guard would not forget them. This certainty, invisible, unshakable, contrasted with the growing silence on German networks. The supplies that did not arrive, the promises that were not fulfilled, the orders that changed without clarity. Bastogne became a seismograph of morals. While the American spirit stiffened under pressure, the German began to crack. It is in this scenario that some of the most emblematic speeches of the campaign emerge. A captain of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, upon being withdrawn from combat with wounds, said, "We were the wolves. Now we are surrounded by iron dogs that do not back down." This symbolic reversal was unthinkable months earlier. The wolf, symbol of offensive and ferocity, now found itself cornered by an enemy that had ceased to be preyed. The iron dog was no longer the soulless American machine. It was the soldier who refused to surrender, even when it made no tactical sense to keep fighting. At meetings of the German High Command, reports about Bastogne began to sound as warnings. Not about territorial losses, but about something more dangerous, the loss of the image of the fragile enemy. If the Americans at Bastogne could hold out under those conditions, what would stop the rest of their forces from doing the same? From that moment on, German propaganda, which insisted on the moral decay of the Allies, lost strength. The soldiers returning from the front no longer believed in her. Bastogne, for the German side, was not only an operational defeat. It was the revelation that the enemy also believed in his own victory. And this, in any war, is a greater threat than any armored vehicle. The breach of expectation was such that a Wehrmacht general, when interrogated in January 1945, revealed, "What happened in Bastogne forced us to revise all our assumptions about how Americans face fear. Until then, fear was the silent weapon of the Germans, the fear that surrounded, that froze, that made the opponent surrender even before the first shot. But not in Bastogne. There, fear changed sides. The city, which was supposed to be a tactical grave, became a lantern in the darkness, illuminating the truth that many in the German general staff refused to see. The war had changed hands. The irony is that even after the breakup, many German generals continued to regard Bastogne as an anomaly, an outlier. But in the following months, that pattern would be repeated. In Remagen, in Cologne, in the forests of the Rhineland. Each new offensive met with not only physical but symbolic resistance. The enemy who had previously hesitated now advanced safely. The army that was once underestimated was now feared. And all this had started there with a nuts and a city that refused to fall. In the next part, you will understand how this invisible victory, the victory of perception, was systematized by the American command, transforming Bastogne from an isolated point of resistance into an operational model for future campaigns. Because when even the enemy admits that his faith has been broken, the war changes phase, and defeat becomes a matter of time. Even before the first shot of the German offensive in the Ardennes echoed through the forests, a map already pointed to Bastogne as a critical node. But that map wasn't in Berlin. It was on the desk of Colonel Oscar Koch, the Third Army's intelligence chief. Koch was not famous nor charismatic like Patton, but his gun was more lethal than an 80-kilometer cannon. Anticipation. While the Germans remained confident in their surprise attack, he was already modeling scenarios of containment, rupture, and counter-offensive based on logistical patterns and previous enemy movements. And so when Bastogne was surrounded, there was no panic in Patton's general staff. There was a plan, and more than that, there was structure to execute it. Unlike German doctrine, which relied on vertical and centralized decisions, the US military operated in redundant layers of command. Each echelon was trained to act autonomously within well-defined limits. This decentralization allowed something unthinkable for the enemy: immediate reaction without waiting for orders. It was war managed as a system, not as a parade of bravery. The invisible preparation made all the difference. Weeks before the German attack, Koch had persuaded Patton to reposition fuel depots 80 km to the north, outside the immediate danger zone, but within operational radius in case a counteroffensive was necessary. It had also begun the reinstallation of terrestrial communication lines parallel to the existing ones, providing for cuts due to sabotage or weather. These actions would seem paranoid in a scenario of stability, but they proved vital when the front line went up in smoke. While the Germans relied on freezing the battlefield, the Americans had already thawed the logic of combat, and instead of reacting to the chaos, they started to control it. It was this doctrine that enabled Patton at Verdun to declare, "Attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours." It was not bravado. It was mathematics. The system was ready. Each American division operated with a modular logistics chain, which allowed complete mobilization based on pre-established plans. The trucks knew where to go, the medical units where to set up posts, the engineers where to open roads, the tanks when they advance. None of this was visible to the naked eye, but it was present in every synchronized movement of the advance. American doctrine did not value only individual heroism. He valued systemic heroism. Meanwhile, on the German side, the system suffered from chronic rigidity. The doctrine of Auftragstaktik, an initiative limited to junior officers, had been eroded by Hitler's increasingly tight control and a centralized command obsessed with maps and illusions. The elite divisions were waiting for orders to move. The Luftwaffe, lacking tactical autonomy, needed approvals for each mission, and attempts at counterattacks were thwarted by the inability to reposition troops in a timely manner. What started as a blitzkrieg now moved in slow motion. At this point, it is worth a reality check. While Germany manufactured just over 1,300 Panzer IV tanks per year, the United States produced more than 2,600 Sherman tanks per month. That's right, per month. The Chrysler plant in Detroit was a war assembly line that wouldn't stop. The Germans, seeing these numbers after the war, classified the American industrial effort with a single word: unaufhaltbar, unstoppable. If this statistic surprised you, write in the comments with one word: shocking data. The brain of change, however, went beyond industry. It was in the way Americans turned data into doctrine. After each battle, specialized teams analyzed logistical and tactical errors, generating reports that were distributed to units in the field. Bastogne was not defeated by courage or steel alone. It was won over by a culture of continuous learning. When Patton insisted that each commander know the other's plan, he did not speak out of vanity. He spoke for redundancy. If one officer fell, another would take over. If one plan failed, another would go into effect. There was no dependence on genius. There was preparation. This systematic approach made the US military a quasi-organic entity. What the Germans saw as American chaos improvisations, adaptations, decentralized decisions, was actually the reflection of a doctrine made for the unexpected. While the Germans were still striving for perfection on paper, the Americans were already operating from the changing reality of the countryside. What was seen in Bastogne was the triumph of this mentality, the victory of anticipation over desperate improvisation. When the siege broke and the city was liberated, it was not just a division that won. It was a structure. The American command knew that wars are not won only in combat. They are won in supply, in communication, in intelligence, in faith. Patton could be the face of victory, but it was Koch and so many other anonymous people who wrote the algorithms of success. The war of the future, as the Germans themselves would admit, would not be won by bravery or brilliant maneuvers. It would be won by whoever best understood the invisible. In the next part, we will see how the air power of the United States, hitherto limited by clouds, descends like a logistical hammer from the skies. Because when the sky finally opens, it's not just the light that comes in. It is the full weight of a nation that refuses to lose. While the maps pointed to divisions, tanks, and lines of advance, inside Bastogne, the war was fought in silence, in the basements, in the makeshift shelters, in the icy corridors of chapels turned into hospitals. There, far from the official communiques and the speeches of the generals, were those who sustained the weight of the resistance without ever receiving a medal. Belgian nurses, such as René Lemaire, braved the cold and daily fear to clean open wounds without anesthesia, often dying along with the patients they tried to save. Lemaire would lose her life on Christmas Day, hit by a German bomb while helping the wounded. A death that did not change the course of the conflict, but sealed with blood the dignity of the civilian effort. In the trenches, doctors operated with field knives, by candlelight, improvising bandages with pieces of uniforms. Without morphine, without blood, without the promise of ransom, they made life and death decisions in seconds. There was an invisible war going on, and here, doctrine was just a distant word. Outside, in the frozen lines that defended the city, were soldiers who rarely appear in the books. Men like the gunners of the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, a battalion made up mostly of African Americans, operating 155 mm guns under constant bombardment. They were not there for prestige or recognition. They were there because they knew that if the line fell, there would be no one left between the Germans and the Allied logistical heartland. The structural racism of the United States Army prevented them from being promoted, decorated, or even officially recognized for their role. But his artillery pieces kept firing, even as supplies ran low and commanders hesitated. One observer described, "They struggled with the silence of those who have fought their whole lives for respect." Their war was twofold, against the enemy and against oblivion. In communications, radio operators kept the line alive between outposts and command centers, even when each transmission could be intercepted and tracked. One mistake, 1 second of hesitation, and an entire platoon would be annihilated by indirect fire. These men, often too young to vote in their country, kept the pulse of resistance in real time. Field engineers, known only as the ghosts of the dawn, risked their lives every night to repair roads, reinforce bridges, and unclog snow-blocked trails, all at constant risk of ambushes and mines. Inside the houses taken as shelter, exhausted soldiers shared melted snow like water and pieces of ration as if they were gold. In an internal report, a commander noted that there were men using newspaper as thermal insulation inside their boots after amputations due to frostbite began to multiply. They didn't have the luxury of strategy, only resistance. And yet they held positions, responded to every attack, and day after day thwarted German chronology. The reality is that, in Bastogne, victory was not sealed in maps, but in the eyes of those who refused to retreat. A wounded sergeant, as he was taken to a church shelter, asked, "Are we still holding the line?" When he heard that he was, He smiled, despite the hemorrhage. It was this obstinacy that the Germans could not measure. Because it didn't show up in intelligence reports, it could not be estimated in number of tanks or caliber of weapons. It was made up of soul, of faith, of an almost irrational refusal to accept the end. And it was this that allowed the city to hold out until Patton's arrival. When the tanks finally broke down, many of these unsung heroes were either too dead or too exhausted to comprehend the scale of what they had done. In the following days, the press would celebrate the bravery of the commanders, divisions, and generals. But the raw truth was in the unofficial records, in the memories rescued years later, in the forgotten voices that told about the man who shared the last cigarette with the wounded enemy, about the nurse who covered the ears of a dying boy so that he would not hear the screams next to him, about the radio operator who, even wounded, he entered the bombing coordinates until his last force. These are stories that official history usually ignores, but which support the deeper truth of war. The machine can conquer territories, but only the soul conquers time. In the next part, we will analyze how this invisible effort found its symbolic and strategic consecration, when the United States, with its industrial supremacy, showed the world that even faith could be mass-produced and launched from the sky with millimeter precision. Because the victory in Bastogne was much more than a liberation, it was the institutionalization of hope as a weapon. Nuts, a four-letter word, spoken almost with disregard, would become an emblem of something much greater than the refusal of an ultimatum. To the Germans, it sounded like an indecipherable code, a childish insult, or a proof of desperation disguised as bravado. But for the Americans, and for the Allies who learned of the episode in the following days, that answer epitomized a moral doctrine. Resistance was not an option. It was identity. Quickly, the phrase crossed the trench. Within days, "nuts" was scrawled on the walls of field hospitals, embroidered by nurses on uniform patches, printed on propaganda leaflets and school murals. The army turned the episode into a symbol. And more than that, in psychological doctrine. Resistance was no longer just physical or strategic. It had gained a motto, a common vocabulary of moral stubbornness in the face of tyranny. This cultural appropriation was not accidental. The U.S. War Department itself encouraged the spread of the word on recruiting posters and internal newsletters. "Say it with pride, nuts to surrender," read a sign that circulated among new enlistees. The objective was clear, to mold the esprit de corps based not only on discipline, but on the categorical refusal of submission. War thus also became a dispute of language. While the Germans used rigid orders and vertical commands, the Americans taught short, impactful, emotionally charged sentences. Nuts became a kind of secular prayer, a silent scream that preceded the fire. A constant reminder that even without ammunition, without reinforcement, and without guarantee of victory, dignity could still speak loudly. With the end of the war, this word did not die in the fields of Belgium. It has crossed oceans and decades, resignified with each new threat. In Cold War psychological warfare manuals, the Bastogne episode was cited as an example of symbolic resistance. McAuliffe's refusal, a pragmatic general with no inclination toward theatricality, became a case study in military academies as a gesture of moral leadership, and at the same time it served as a popular inspiration. In movies, comics, books, and even TV commercials, nuts has gained legendary status. But its value was not in the humor, nor in the casualness of the answer. It was in its strategic function, to dismantle the enemy through incomprehension. The Germans, accustomed to centuries-old formal terms and war protocols, did not know what to do with it. Not understanding the language of the enemy is often the first sign of defeat. More than a military symbol, nuts has become a democratic symbol. In a world polarized between totalitarian regimes and imperfect democracies, the simple and direct refusal of an imposed surrender has become a metaphor for civil resistance. In political speeches, especially during the Cold War, U.S. congressmen cited Bastogne as proof that in the face of oppression, the American people would respond with the same moral clarity. To this day, the word is engraved on commemorative plaques at the Bastogne Memorial, the Museum of Military History, and monuments across the United States. It's a reminder that sometimes greatness doesn't need long speeches, just the right word at the right time. But beyond the symbols, the episode reveals a strategic truth. In war, morals and doctrine go hand in hand. The enemy may have more tanks, more ammunition, more soldiers, but if you don't understand the moral force of refusal, you'll always be vulnerable to the unpredictable. This is what Bastogne proved. The Wehrmacht, with all its experience, with all its encirclement logic, did not foresee that a single general would say no with such conviction that his answer would echo for generations. In 1984, during a ceremony in the city, an American veteran summarized, "We didn't know if we were going to live, but we knew that the one thing we couldn't do, it was giving up." Bastogne became the ground zero of this philosophy. And there is an additional irony in all this. German military culture valued code, precision, written order. The Americans, on the other hand, children of a nation forged in rebellion, responded with phrases that seemed improvised, but contained centuries of indomitable spirit. When McAuliffe said nuts, he didn't just speak for himself. He spoke for an entire culture, one that saw freedom not as a guarantee, but as a constant challenge. And it is in this contrast of doctrines, in this collision between order and spirit, that Bastogne becomes a microcosm of the war as a whole. In the next part, we'll dive into the invisible engineering that underpinned all of this resistance, because behind every word spoken, there were miles of hand-laid telephone wires, barrels of fuel hidden under the snow, and logistical spreadsheets that even predicted the consumption of soap. If nuts was the symbol of the soul, what follows reveals the mastermind behind the victory. Even after the breaking of the siege on 26 December, Bastogne did not rest. The city, now partially opened, became a field of constant friction where every reconquered meter was fought for with blood and steel. The Germans, still believing in a symbolic reversal, launched sporadic counterattacks with what was left of their mobile forces. The nightly bombardments returned with fury, trying to silence the newly erected morale of American troops, but it was too late. From that moment on, the heavens belonged to America. In a massive air maneuver that symbolized the beginning of the definitive strategic turnaround, 34,000 sorties by Allied aviation, including fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft, swept the roads, forests, and villages around Bastogne. It was more than retaliation. It was pure tactical engineering. The Luftwaffe, already reduced to a fraction of the strength it boasted in 1940, was unable to put up significant resistance. Its pilots, poorly trained and with rationed fuel, could barely take off. What German generals called organized defense went up in smoke. Within 48 hours, ammunition warehouses were destroyed, bridges blown up, armored columns paralyzed before they even entered combat. A German commander reported, "The planes came like swarms of flies, but each one of them carried death with millimeter precision." Indeed, as the panzer divisions retreated, with no fuel, no cover, and, perhaps more serious, no faith, the U.S. Army widened its offensive. Bastogne ceased to be a symbol of resistance and became a platform for advancement. The shaft had turned. War, once reactive, became proactive. Allied warehouses, once used to hold a line, now supplied offensives that advanced for hundreds of miles. And ironically, all of this happened because of the German obsession with taking a city that should have been just a stepping stone and became its undoing. Meanwhile, The American support structure operated at a factory pace. The medical evacuation system removed the wounded in C-47 planes adapted for life support. In less than 12 hours, a wounded soldier in Bastogne could be in a hospital in England. The rearguard, silent and invisible, was the force that consolidated the victory. Logistics officers adjusted supply routes in real time, often during the flight of the transports. Mobile warehouses, mounted on trucks, ensured that ammunition, food and fuel were always within 10 kilometers of the front line. It was war as a continuous process and not as an isolated battle. And in this process, Germany no longer had a way to compete. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Climate, geography, and even tactical surprise were on the German side. But they ignored the variable that since 1942 had been growing inexorably, the industrial and logistical power of the United States. While the Germans measured their strength by the number of tanks and divisions, the Americans counted cargo ships, railroad convoys, supply sheets, and days of inventory. It was a war won not only by those who shot best, but by those who could keep a supply line alive thousands of miles from home. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts and understanding the war beyond the trenches, show your support. Like and subscribe so that we can continue to bring you this type of content where the story is revealed in the details. The last German counterattack in the vicinity of Bastogne was recorded on January 2, 1945. He failed before he started. Only the retreat remained. And in the retreat, the enemy saw what he had really faced. Not just an army, but a system, a culture, a doctrine based on predictability and abundance. The next part will reveal just that, how air, logistical, and symbolic dominance has been institutionalized as the ultimate strategic advantage, turning every battlefield into an extension of American industry. Because when the heavens belong to you, the earth is not long in coming. Today, Bastogne is not just a Belgian city, it is a sanctuary. Its streets, once covered in ice and gunpowder, are now home to memorials, museums and bells that ring to remember. The Bastogne Memorial stands in the shape of a star, with the names of American states etched in cold stone, while Sherman tanks, preserved as steel ghosts, silently guard the entrances to the city. But there is something deeper than architecture. Bastogne's scars are alive, not as wounds, but as lessons. Every local child learns the meaning of nuts before they even understand the grammar. In the squares, former American soldiers, now with silver hair, are received like children who return home. And it's not because of military victory, it's because of human endurance. Bastogne did not fall, and it redefined his identity forever. The trenches can still be visited, some kept exactly as they were in December 1944, with rotting wood, pieces of helmets, rusty ration cans. They are small, cold, claustrophobic spaces. Inside, the story is not told, it is felt. Silent visitors walk along the preserved lines, listening to the wind that once carried shouts and orders. Local guides tell stories of doctors who operated with field knives, of soldiers who wrote farewell letters on damp papers, and of civilians who sheltered wounded without knowing if they would see the sunrise. There is a hand-painted phrase on one of the preserved entrances. Here, hope froze, but it did not die. This is the spirit of Bastogne. The reconstruction of the city was not only physical, it was cultural. The residents turned the trauma into devotion. Annual parties honor veterans. Families adopted American divisions as symbolic patrons. Schools name fallen soldiers, and even former enemies. German soldiers who survived were invited to return, many moved by the warm welcome. Because Bastogne, unlike other battlefields, was not marked by destruction, but by the moral integrity of those who resisted. It was there that the narrative of the Second World War gained a rare nuance, that of mutual respect between those who fought on opposite sides but recognized in pain the shared humanity. This reverence is not accidental. It was born from the understanding that victory on that frozen soil was not simply military, it was spiritual. Bastogne became a symbol not for what he took, but for what he refused to give up. While Berlin represents the collapse of the Nazi Empire and Hiroshima the weight of the atomic age, Bastogne represents the power of a negative, a no said under fire, hunger and cold, but held firmly. And that's why year after year, thousands of people travel there, not to celebrate war, but to remind us that human courage, when well conducted, can freeze even the most calculated offensives. In the residents' accounts, there are details that history manuals do not capture. The constant smell of smoke, the low-pitched sound of boots in the snow, the sight of parachutes carrying packages that looked like miracles, and above all, the presence of Americans, hungry, wounded, but smiling at children and sharing chocolate bars. The strongest image is not of a tank breaking through the enemy line. It's of a soldier covering a Belgian baby with his own coat, knowing that he might not live to get it back. These memories, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren, underpin what Bastogne has become, an altar of freedom. But the city also carries its shadows. Military cemeteries with endless rows of white crosses recall the cost of resistance. Each of them is a silent reminder that the word nuts has come at a price paid with youth, with a future, with unfulfilled promises. And even so, those who stayed come back. American veterans who lost friends in Bastogne travel thousands of miles just to stand in silence before a tombstone. There is no revenge in these gestures, just respect, a respect that translates into tears, silence, memory. That is the ultimate irony of the Battle of the Bulge. The city that the Germans thought would be just an annotation on their maps became one of the most remembered of the war, not because of the destruction it caused, but because of the faith it preserved. Bastogne showed that the true strength of an army lies not only in the tanks it possesses, but in the values it defends. And he showed the world that in the face of arrogance, integrity can still win. In the next part, we will analyze how this moral and symbolic victory translated into doctrinal change, and how the United States consolidated its position not only as a military power, but as a logistical paradigm of warfare in the 20th century. The history of Bastogne, if read only as a military chapter, is incomplete. What happened there transcends maps and divisions. It is a rare intersection between technique and soul, between the mathematics of war and the faith of men who refused to break. When 18,000 Americans were surrounded by 55,000 Germans, the equation pointed to surrender. But Bastogne did not obey common logic, because there was something there that numbers don't measure: invisible preparation, resistant morals, convinced leadership and doctrine molded for adaptation. As the Germans counted divisions and rounded hills, the Americans laid plans months in advance, prepared their soldiers for the unpredictable, and fueled hope with supplies and symbols. What the Germans called stubbornness became a strategy, and what they considered a favorable climate became the enemy itself. In Bastogne, the American doctrine proved to be more than strength. It was vision. Patton didn't improvise a salvation. He engineered it in advance, thanks to his ability to anticipate scenarios, decentralize decisions, and align logistics with moral faith. This war was won long before the first bullet pierced the snow. It was beaten at the supply depots built 160 kilometers before the front. It was won in meetings where colonels discussed retreat routes that they would never need to use. It was defeated in the training camps, where soldiers learned that to lead was to know how to improvise. And it was won in a single nuts that redefined courage as a collective act. This is the lesson that Bastogne bequeathed to the military academies of the world. To win is not to dominate, it is to resist when everything points to surrender. The fighting spirit, when well guided, is worth more than twice as much as enemy troops. Tanks can be manufactured in series, but trust, resilience and purpose are built over a culture. Bastogne showed that war is not just a battlefield. It is doctrine, rearguard, communication, morals, meteorology and faith. The city became compulsory study at West Point, Sandhurst and Saint-Cyr. But it has also become a living metaphor in crisis rooms, in command centers, and in speeches by leaders who must decide between resisting or retreating. And there is still a political lesson. The Germans, masters of rapid offensives and armored movements, failed to understand that the 20th century no longer tolerated victories by brute force. Bastogne taught that superiority lies not only in the speed of advancement, but in the consistency of the structure that supports it. The post-war world came to value alliances, supplies, planning, and integrated technology. Modern warfare has since been won by those who manage scarcity best, not by those who bet everything on surprise. It was in Bastogne that Germany discovered belatedly that it was facing an enemy that not only shot, but thought like a system. And finally, there is the human lesson. Bastogne is taught as a tactician, but it should be remembered as an example. When all seemed lost, the cold, amputated limbs, supplies ran out, surrender was considered logical, the men on the ground decided they would hold out, not because they were guaranteed to win, but because they were sure that giving in would be more than a military defeat. It would be a moral breach. That choice resonates to this day. In civil crises, in political battles, in social emergencies, Bastogne appears as a symbol of what can happen when you say no with integrity. No to collapse, no to inhumanity, no to surrender. And perhaps this is the most powerful reason why Bastogne did not fall, because it represents something that no German calculation foresaw. It represents what a people can do when their soul is still standing, even if their feet are frozen. It represents the triumph of conviction over calculation, of faith over strength, of logistics over arrogance. And if today it is in the pages of combat manuals, it should also be in the hearts of those who one day will have to resist with nothing except purpose, because the real victory is not taken, it is sustained. And the next installment will reveal how that learning shaped the post-war era, cementing a new way of thinking about power, war, and leadership, not just in the US, but in every nation that understood what really happened in Bastogne. What if it was you? Not as a general nor as a historian, but as an ordinary man or woman, sunk up to his knees in frozen mud, his boots torn, his fingers bandaged unexpectedly, his eyes fixed on a horizon of silence and smoke. No promises, no heat, only the mission to resist. That is exactly what thousands experienced in Bastogne, not for glory, but for loyalty. Their trench wasn't just a hole in the earth. It was a moral choice, dug by hand. They didn't know if the tanks would come. They weren't sure if the radios would work. They didn't know if that morning would be the last. But they stayed, not because they were stronger, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves. The question now is no longer about Patton, McAuliffe, or the Third Army. It's about you. What is your Bastogne? In what part of life are you surrounded, exhausted, cold, and yet deciding not to back down? Who are his soldiers next door, silent, sharing what little is left? Military history often forgets these details, but it is in them that victory begins. Because before the tanks broke the snow, it was the silence that was not broken. And if today the world still remembers Bastogne, it is not because of the victory itself, but because of the refusal to surrender when everything was stopped. This is the trench that each one carries. And in the next chapter, we turn our eyes to the conclusion, how the greatest superpower of the century learned to win not only with steel, but with conviction, and how Bastogne taught that the greatest power is not in the machine, but in the spirit that drives it. Bastogne did not fall. It was the illusion of German invincibility that collapsed. The Wehrmacht, which for years had advanced with speed and terror, found there not an army superior in tactics, but in structure. The American victory was sealed not only by the arrival of tanks or aerial bombardment, but by the precise chaining of logistics, adaptation, and faith. While the Germans calculated advance on maps, the Americans repositioned fuel depots, converted prayers into meteorology, and integrated every supply thread into frontline morale. The German collapse at Bastogne was not just military, it was ideological. It was the moment when the doctrine of lightning, of blind, swift advance, stumbled upon the silent resistance of hungry, frozen men who said, "Nuts!" No. The great lesson that Bastogne leaves to history is simple and brutal. In wars of attrition, the winner is not the one who shoots first, but the one who can stand the longest. Logistics determines the strategy. Volume destroys the illusion of isolated tactical genius. And as General Alfred Jodl, already captured, confessed when asked about the German defeat, "We were overcome by an avalanche of steel, rubber and food." If you value this search for historical truth and the memory of the facts that shaped the world, support our work with a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Leave it in the comments. What was the most shocking data you discovered in this video? And remember, don't go away just yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.